Hey, good morning, everybody. It is Chris Pope from ServiceNow here from the Strategy Office. Welcome you to our webinar today talking about service delivery performance in a multi-supplier world, or sometimes often referred to as SIAM. Very happy today to have quite a distinguished guest with us, Dan Stavola from Ernst Young. Morning, Dan.
Good morning, Chris. Good morning, everybody.
Thanks for joining, everybody. So I can still see people coming into the room. So just while we're waiting for that, and we'll get going straight away. As we go along, there is live Q&A as part of the session. So on your webinar session, in the bottom corner, I think there's a Q&A panel. So please put your questions in there, and we'll definitely respond to them. We've got time for Q&A at the end, where we'll try and address as many of them as we can in a kind of open style. And then if there are additional ones that require follow-up, then you'll get a response from us in the next couple of days as well. So without further ado, I think we can get going and start talking about this, what is really a hot topic. So for some of you, are new to ServiceNow in terms of what we do and why we do it. We were born as a cloud company about 10 years ago. And really what we're focusing on is managing service and changing the way people do work in the enterprise. Our original roots were in ITSM, and we still, have a huge focus around that, as there's still many platforms, many solutions out there that customers are really struggling with upgrading, modernizing, and transforming in their enterprises. And we see some, incredible numbers in terms of growth that happen for us on a quarterly basis. So right now, we're just north of 2,800 customers globally, almost 3,500 employees, and then we have major sites all around the world, as you would pretty much predict in terms of, office locations, sales locations, and also data centers. So we have 16 paired data centers around the world, which are the little red dots on that map. And then, bigger picture, we kind of predicted last year that we would be a $1 billion in revenue company, and we succeeded that target, which means we're only the second software as a service company in the world ever to do that. And now we're on our march to 2020 and some new figures and some new targets in terms of kind of where we're going and what we're trying to do. So you'll see us start to take bigger stances and bigger positions in many different areas of the service management space, not just in IT, but also across other lines of business like HR, facilities, marketing, finance, security, and so on. So in terms of this content, managing suppliers, and we're one of them as well, that many of you that work with, and we still have a lot of runway to go in terms of who we're working with at the moment globally. It's very difficult. Often the core responsibility or the delivery aspects don't always sit within IT. Many of you might have a vendor management office or a supply chain department who do really kind of, I would say, quite reactive work, often around when there's a breach or we have a contractual issue, maybe there is a performance or service issue, but also around contract renewal times. That's typically when people kind of light up and we're chasing around to get a PO. But we're not doing anything really proactive or from a kind of holistic view to manage these on a constant basis, have insight to what's going on. And then the other side of it is these days there's very few, or a lot less, I should say, wholesale deals where organizations are shipping out large, massive quantities of their services. And there's more sort of a la carte options. If you look at just cloud platforms alone, you've got Google, you've got Amazon, you've got Microsoft, you've got the rack spaces of the world. And, whichever vertical you look at, storage is another great example. You can be picky. You can be almost quite fickle in your choices now because the move is very easy to do. And you're really kind of getting into that commodity type situation. Now, the challenge is, all these moving parts, how, at a CIO level, do you demonstrate control of their business, right? And what's going on, and all these different competing priorities of kind of what's going on in your environment. So then, you've got multiple suppliers. In this case, we've got 4, but many of you have probably got 50, 80, hundreds in some cases. So then you kind of have this juggling act of trying to figure out what's going on. We make some grand statements often about TCO and ROI, but how do we track them? How do we manage them? But also how we actually proving the service is giving us the value. And if you look across IT as a whole, they might be accountable for delivering a service to the business, but they're not always responsible on a daily basis because they've moved that to another provider. So what tends to happen is you start getting challenged with scale, performance, the business is adding more demand, often from an innovation standpoint, and you kind of get stuck in this mode. And often because they can't scale and perform, that the supplier may have been good at that time, you potentially end up with another one, and then you add another one, and it just gets more and more complex over time. And then you actually have, the people doing their jobs, and it's a nightmare for them to navigate across multiple tools, multiple silos, multiple groups trying to coordinate service. And if you have a single, maybe a project or a change or something you need to implement, you potentially go across multiple of those suppliers, and you end up with this huge coordination exercise versus trying to really focus on solving the problem and what that value looks like. And then you have the classic bounce, right, where it's not us, it's them. Well, it's them or it's not us, and vice versa. And you end up in this situation where work is bounced around multiple organizations, often internal, often external. And how do you even track that? How do you even manage it? That holy grail of SLAs and reporting and metrics that we often start out with becomes very, very difficult to measure and manage and really pin down and focus on, kind of continual service improvement, if you will, because the data is just in so many different places and difficult to get to. And if you look at that from a challenges standpoint, this is more of a summary, increased complexity and overhead, very little clarity into kind of obligations of what's going on, when's it important, when's it not important, what's even in scope. And you end up with this finger-pointing exercise, and it just doesn't add to a very healthy environment. And then you have challenges around data, right? Back in the 70s and 80s, this term e-bonding came about. Really, it's about integrations. Many customers that we've seen recently, talk about this situation where they have it with telco or lease line providers and so on. It's really just an integration at the end of the day, but e-bonding, was kind of cool back in the 80s, but it's not anymore. And then how do you monitor and measure these things? As I said, end to end. If you're trying to work across disparate systems and bring things together, that becomes really difficult. And rather than trying to solve the problem of delivering better service levels, you're actually just managing this huge pot of glue and this spaghetti wiring of trying to make all these systems talk together on a consistent basis, and everybody use the same terminology, maybe the same decision matrix, risk and impact and those kind of different things. So it becomes very, very challenging to do that type of stuff. So what could this look like, right? As you know, this is a ServiceNow webinar, so we're going to talk about how we've done this and how we're working with customers today. And I would say, kind of in terms of what I've dealt with, there's probably a good 20 to 30 customers worldwide who have embarked on this SIAM model or methodology and gone way beyond the classic kind of ticket exchange mentality and really trying to get higher up the food chain in terms of the services they're managing or they're accountable for, and making suppliers in a multi-supplier model very responsible for the piece of the jigsaw, if you will, that it is that they're providing. So what does this give us? Lots of improved visibility, better metrics, and what we've seen is there tends to be two modes, and it often can depend on the supplier in terms of their specialist capability that you're kind of sourcing for. Often, very traditional operational support type things. We see many suppliers onboarding onto ServiceNow and actually working in the same platform as the customer. And then in some other cases where maybe you're managing a huge data center for a customer, you might have some different asset management capability or monitoring in some cases of power, cooling, whatever. We're finding they're being brought in as an integration as a core capability to support the processes of request, change, incident, etc., that they're actually running on the platform. So what does this do? This actually helps us bring lots of different things together, and then we're able to really concentrate on less of the back and forth, but focus on working in these process places in the same way. So we can start to leverage automation. We've got core ITSM, which, is still the lifeblood of many organizations. And then on the right, we start to have more of these integrations, and then also custom applications. These suppliers are subject matter experts in their spaces, and we're going to them because this isn't a skill set we necessarily have, and they might often have their own tools and technology. So, how do we embrace that but bring that together as a core single platform? Analytics reporting are great. Often we just count things, but really starting to get higher up that food chain, as I said, into financial management and billing, and really looking at the true cost of service, what it means, what's the benefit. It's great we're paying this money for this per year, but all we've done is really moved a problem. Are we getting the benefits from it that we expected? And then you start to do, contract and supplier management, and really proactively managing these suppliers to deliver the services, and you get a lot more. We hear this a lot with customers. They want a partnership. They don't want to work with a vendor. So how do you do that? Well, it's that kind of bi-directional insight into what's going on, what the services are, and improving those relationships over time. And now that, cloud's obviously a big thing, and it's here to stay, and we go somewhere else from here. But in terms of maturity, you still have the same risk and compliance and audit challenges that you always had as an organization. But now other people or other providers are responsible for delivering those daily services. But how do you bring them into that scope and understand it so that you're not at further risk and less finger pointing is going on? And, if something does happen where you have an audit or risk controls have to be updated, it's that better together approach rather than saying, oh, this is so-and-so provider, and, we have to navigate and manage that, and the systems are different, and the landscape's very different as well. And then, as you start to try and improve things, you start looking at your portfolio of services. So who's providing this? Not that long ago, there was a price war in compute with Amazon and Google. It's probably still going on. But, am I getting the bang for the buck that I was hoping for? Are there better options out there for me? And then, in this cloud world, security, we see it on the news every day. Someone's had a breach, someone's had an issue, data's been stolen, etc. How do we kind of bring all that together so that we work together as a single operation? So lots of cool kind of buzzwords in there, if you will, about making this happen. And what we want to do, and why Dan's on the call with me, is to kind of give you some examples of some of the ways, and things to think about as we've done this in terms of preparing and starting this journey. And it's not just a technology problem in terms of what's going on. So, there are many benefits. I've been through quite a few of these already around measurement and flexibility. And you can almost be a little bit finicky around your suppliers and bringing them on board and off board on a fairly frequent basis, rather than these large monolithic sort of 2-year, 3-year projects to switch suppliers out, move from one, move to another, and so on. So if we just kind of go into this, and, I'd like to switch to Dan briefly. The good news here is Dan's he's not just a consultant, if you will. Dan's a pretty strong practitioner and worked recently with some large financial institutions in the U.S. And, I want him to kind of share some insights in terms of the prep activity, some of the execution steps of, okay, great, we're going to do this. Kind of where do we go from here? So, Dan, do you want to talk to this slide for a few minutes?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. So, folks, as we approached being able to create an environment where suppliers become part of the ecosystem, we thought through all of the things that IT has been doing now for a lot of years in terms of industrializing operations, right? And those are very standard things in terms of, what a mature organization looks like today. Creating that, operating model, so looking at the organization, and when we think about SIAM and we think about the organization, we think about the role that the vendor's playing in the organization, and what they're providing, and making sure that We're aligning that vendor to our organizational values, right? Our key measures, our business importance, and making sure that there's alignment there. We want to reduce complexity, right? So today, you know, we spent a lot of time in terms of making sure that our organization runs well, and then we bring in this extra cog, right, that we don't have a place for in terms of making the machine run, and therefore there's this gap in being able to coordinate, being able to have accountability, being able to, you know, very quickly understand performance and understand where we need to improve. So that whole organizational construct, that operating model, is a first key component. Where do we plug the vendor in? The second component becomes governance, right? And if we think about governance, it's the ability to have transparency and insight into what that vendor is doing, what their obligations are, right? And this extends a bit into contract management and vendor management. So there's a tie here between what the contractual obligations are, the alignment to what the organization needs to achieve, and the importance of those functions, and making sure that the vendor understands those well, but then also understands how they play in providing that service, right? So we start to look at this from an end-to-end service perspective, and from a governance perspective, we want to understand key controls, decision points, the ability to report, and the ability to escalate and manage at the right times. So once we have that construct in place, right, and an understanding how we might execute, a couple of things we have to think about. Some of the trends we've seen in outsourcing has been an organization not being good at providing a particular service, outsourcing that service, right? But then also in outsourcing that service, not necessarily having the right level of control over the vendor, right? So when we think about execution, there's a couple of things we want to consider. First is we want to make sure that our operation is somewhat mature, that we have the ability to manage the process ourselves, right? We want to move to more of a distributed model, right, and not a decentralized model. So if we've industrialized process for ourselves and the way that we do our work, we want to make sure the vendor doesn't break that model. So when we bring those in, and we can align on best practice, right, things like ITIL and COVID, right? Everybody today has adopted those standards, and they're pretty much the same, right? I think where the difference is, and when we look at being prepared to bring a vendor in and work with a vendor, a lot of vendors will say, hey, look, we've got this all figured out. We've got a model baked, right? Just come to us, we'll do everything for you, right? So we get this point in which we're able to face off against the vendor but not integrate with the vendor. So as we think through execution, we're really talking about weaving in that vendor's responsibilities into what we do and make them part of the fabric of the organization. By doing that, we set ourselves up really well from a performance perspective, right? If you think today about some of the challenges that you have in your environment, what we're seeing with clients that we're working with, being able to report on performance, both in terms of leading indicators and lagging indicators. Let me just dig into that for a second, right? If I am managing the work that's going on, if I am retaining the information, then I have the ability from a performance perspective to see things in real time, right? Where most of the times the way that these constructs are set up, they're set up in a way where performance is reported after the fact, and that information are just lagging indicators, right? So it takes a lot more time to be able to steer the ship, right? So you lose that agility. So from a performance perspective, we want to make sure that the construct of the service levels are in line with the service, that we have, somewhat of a balanced scorecard in place in terms of what we're accountable to be able to report on and from a performance perspective to the business, right? And make sure that the vendor's performance is an underpinning and an integral part of that, right? So we want to build that reporting structure and that management system and have it in place. So if we architect this ahead of time, right, and then we do one of two things, is we pull vendors in and out, we bring them into this construct, we're then not recreating all of these values and all of these activities on a one-off basis, where a lot of those have been done previously in the past.
Cool. Thanks, Dan. Really, really good and insightful. And I think, what we're trying to help with is, this is still quite an immature methodology, right? And it's really starting to change the way we think. And I think one of the things you touched on a lot was it's really about bringing that supplier's capability into your existing world. And it may improve certain things, of course, but I think unless it's embedded and ingrained as part of it, you're always going to keep it or refer to it almost as this outsource type situation of them and us, rather than this more partnership and augmented solution and delivery. So I think, that's huge. And if we look at kind of outcomes of what this might look like, standardized and consistent processes, absolutely huge. And often, one of the nirvanas, if you will, even doing that internally with your own organizations is hard enough, let alone when you have suppliers. Reporting, performance, and efficiency type things. And one of the things that often happens, and, for those of you who know me would know I was a customer of ServiceNow 3 times in the past. And, I've done these type of things and outsourcing and gone to suppliers. And innovation is always, one of the things they talk about of how they're going to improve your services and come to you with X number of these or that every year. That's often very difficult to track and understand and even get near, because you're still stuck in the day-to-day tactical working of that service with knowledge transition, and you may have some bumps in the road, etc. And it becomes quite difficult to kind of raise your game above all of that day-to-day minutia. And really, all you've done is move the problem rather than try and resolve it. So innovation and making things better, hopefully in these situations, because you go into these specialist providers in many cases, frees up your time and definitely your resource to do these. And I think one of the bigger ones is around this kind of governance and controls. We get audited more, we've got more regulators, we've got more requirements. Now that we've got more players delivering our services, it becomes very, very important to bring that across the entire stack of our service providers, both internal and external, to have that single view, if you will, or that pane of glass view of the world. So then, it would be remiss of us not to talk about some tooling, given, there's so much technology enablement out there, whether it's the cloud-based platforms, if it's cloud compute, the way we still, run certain things in our environments that we do because it's our source of record or our system of record to actually run our businesses on a daily basis. So, again, I'm going to hand back to Dan here briefly, and this actually came, I think, as a result of this large engagement, as I said earlier, with a large financial services customer recently, in terms of kind of what the approach was, what it looked like, and then how we tried to bridge that gap between both the customer, the client, and then also the third-party provider. So, Dan, do you want to take us through this slide?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. So just a couple of background points. Ernst Young is also a ServiceNow customer. We use the platform on a day-to-day business and serve our customers with the platform. So when we were working with our client, a couple of things that certainly resonated with the client as well as ourselves from how we would advise the client perspective was that they already had ServiceNow in-house, right? So certainly easy enough to leverage the platform. Now, they were looking at outsourcing a whole range of services, and there's a rather large program in place with being able to outsource a whole bunch of services. And it's a transformation type of project where they're changing technologies and bringing a vendor in to do the work. And as they started talking to the vendor said, oh, we have ServiceNow also, right? You can come into our portal and you can use our instance. Being there as an independent advisor, we were able to talk this through with the client and the managed service provider and provide them the advantages of being able to basically create an integration between their two platforms. And what that provided to the customer was, hey, look, the ease of integration is pretty simple, right? You both are on the same platform. Your processes are similar, right? They weren't exact, but they were similar. So the process changes, the configuration changes, these were simple changes. They weren't complex changes, right? Matter of fact, the development work really for each of the process areas that we did, and we had incident management and change management and service request management, and knowledge management in place. The development work was really about a week for each, right? It was just a matter of, understanding some of those integration prerequisites around, web service methods, connectivity, WSDL and endpoint information, right? And then driving down into process integration, workflow development, and then through, the rest of the functional specs and technical specs. So once we talked through that, the client understood the advantage of being able to do this, right? And interesting point here, one of the discussions was, well, do we have somebody independent do the work? Do we have the managed service provider do the work, right? And what the client ended up deciding on was having somebody independent do the work. And when I go back to the slide that we looked at earlier, right, around the whole construct, we want to make sure we pull the vendor into the enterprise environment so that they become part of that organizational support structure, okay? The other thing was, and a couple things you want to consider here, right? So we talk about seamless integration, right? We talk about shared knowledge, right? This isn't something that's to be done from a big bang perspective. What I love about ServiceNow and working with the platform is the ability to be able to implement over time and scale as you mature, right? We're also able to integrate with other platforms. So now that we're working with the client and the client sees the value of this solution, they're now looking at other vendors and pulling in other vendors where we're talking about platforms that are not ServiceNow platforms, they're vendor-specific platforms. And as we work through those integrations aren't difficult either, right? They require a little bit more of a, technical design in terms of, the different endpoints, the different connection points, some of the data conversion it has to go on. But again, not overly complicated. I think the technical end of the work here, not to diminish it, was the smaller part of the work. But what the client is starting to see already is this independence from their vendors, right? Chris spoke about this earlier, flexibility. We hear and see horror stories in terms of re-insourcing work after it's been outsourced for a period of time. What do those operational characteristics look like, right? They look like an organization that doesn't have those processes in place, don't have the controls in place, have lost the knowledge over time after outsourcing it, right? Therefore, it's a monumental effort to be able to bring this back in-house, right? In providing this type of solution, you don't lose the knowledge, right? You don't lose the process capability, you don't lose the oversight and the governance, right? It's just a function of either switching to another vendor or ramping up and bringing people in, right? We're able to demonstrate, even on this project already, the strategic alignment between the service provider, the service that they're providing, and its importance to the business. You see all the time where we do a lot of assessment work where we see that, major outages occur and folks are unable to be able to coordinate fast enough and not, shuffle tickets around or not be able to understand the business context. So already in the operational readiness stage of the project that we're in, we're already starting to see an alignment between the vendor and the client that they're serving in terms of talking through being able to provide this service in a live environment. You end up forcing conversation that you typically wouldn't have without this model. So, common platform to stand on here, an ability to be able to bring folks together, have them coordinate, force them to talk through what are the coordination points, what are the challenges with alignment, how do we automate a lot of that work, how do we make sure that everybody is looking at the same information at the same time. That's really what we liked about this solution. And just from the client side, what they're seeing is a tremendous amount of value, enough to drive them to start to look at other integration points and scale this over time in their enterprise so that they end up having control over all of their major vendors.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dan. So if you look at kind of, the SIAM set of services, if you will, around what's out there and what people are trying to achieve, there's a lot. And it's a lot of things to consume and digest. And there's just no way on this planet that, you can start all of these at once and go down this road. It's kind of like when people say, we're going to do ITIL. That's a big statement and often fraught with danger and often, takes many years, many people. And really, do you ever make it? Does it ever get fully implemented? It's not something that people tend to do. So what we tried to do here was look across, all the stack, and there's some core things here that we're all familiar with, sort of incident problem change and those kind of situations. But, if you're using suppliers to do a lot of this almost commodity type based work with service desks, support organizations, in some case application development, you want to go higher up the food chain and start to manage those more valuable things to your organization that really will drive change, will drive innovation, and free up your own resources, your precious resources, to do these other things. So if you look across this, there's lots of things here, lots of words that we will recognize, but there's some as well that we often would like to get to, but don't always manage to get to. So what we've tried to do is pull together this heat map, whereby this kind of looks at it from a technology structure. And those bigger ticket areas, as I said, of where there's a solution or where there's some technology. This is just suggestive based on, some of the organizations I'm working with and some of my colleagues are working with. It's not definitive. Obviously, there could be many more out there. But what we've tried to do is, where there's a fairly generic gray icon, if you will, that's where ServiceNow has a play, has some functionality or capability out of the box that makes sense, right? That's fairly simple and easy to use and adopt quickly and can start getting you that time to value. And again, this isn't based on our definition of these features or functions. This is more looking at the methodology and the process that SIAM talks to, which in some cases is quite different to what a technology talks about and some of the requirements. And really kind of, I would say, almost being a bit brutal in saying whether you do or don't do some things. And oftentimes what we find with customers, just because you could do something on a certain technology or platform doesn't necessarily mean you should. Now, of course, we'd love you to do everything you ever could in this planet with ServiceNow. But I think in the real world, there's so many suppliers and solutions out there now. It's around that better together ecosystem. So if we look across this, there's some things that jump out very quickly. Things like access management, capacity management. We've got SailPoint, we've got Sumerian. In the testing space, we've got a product or a solution called Cap.io from Cerner Solutions and so on. And what we're trying to do here is say, look, these are features or applications and solutions that have been built and certified to run on the ServiceNow platform. Now, often these would live outside in other point solutions, and you get into this web or this framework, if you will, of integrations, which is fine and complex at times, but it's been proven to work in other situations. But in terms of rapid time to the value, deployment, and really, bringing this ecosystem together, this is a handful of partners, and there's many more who, have put the time and effort in to go through certification of their solution on the ServiceNow platform. It's in our online store, and these are essentially plugins that you would download and suddenly be available to you. Yes, you need configuration and some process work, as you would with anything, and you'd be remiss not to do that. But in terms of bringing it together quickly and simply, this is what it talks to. And then Dan was talking about, integration with other things and looking to onboard further integrations in the client that he's working with. So, we often talk about things like enterprise service buses, web services and REST and all these wonderful technologies. And what we came across were two partners in our ecosystem who've done this in a very controlled and a very structured way, but also scales. And what they've said is, look, hey, provider, this is the way in. This is the key to the kingdom. These are the rules we want you to play by. You can have your own solution if need be. That's fine. But when you interact with this client or this customer, this is the door in. This is how we want the data structured. These are the APIs. These are the kind of operations, if you will, that you can do, whether it's, reading, writing, creating, updating, whatever. But this is the format, and this is the structure and the sequence we want it in. But also we can control it in a very simple and easy way. So we know where it's coming from, when it's coming from, what it looks like, and an even good quality in some cases. Certainly where you have the use case we talked of earlier briefly about the data centers, the data center providers providing you a feed of all your CIs and different things. Well, what happens if there's a feed that comes in that's not quite right? It's got data quality issues. You potentially don't want to accept that feed or that inbound data because, you could end up with a bigger mess in CMDB or a bunch of inaccurate records that could drive some process or organizations to make inaccurate decisions ultimately. So this is kind of a heat map view of that. And what we found is many customers are already starting to kind of use this model to start to plug in. And in some cases, they're using it to even identify what they've already got. And they go into this mode of very much sort of buy, sell, and hold. And they see this ecosystem of things they're managing. And there may be an internal thing on here. And say, you know what? We're not good there. This isn't best of breed. It was a good decision however many years or months ago. That might be an area we want to go to and say, you know what? That's the way to go. They manage that as a service. It's cloud-based. We can get going a lot quicker and a lot simpler and have much better tooling than we've ever had before to run those services for the organization. So then in terms of kind of things you need to consider technically, if you will, and I'll ask Dan to run through this quickly, lots of different things that, sometimes we take for granted, but they're all kind of items that, all would play into maybe a bid process, a selection process, and those kind of things. So Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so just running through left to right here, when you think about being able to bring a vendor in and work with them and provide tighter integration, you sort of have to know your vendor, right? If it's an existing vendor, they have a contract in place. Changing some of those parameters can have impact from a contractual obligation perspective and may require some renegotiation of contracts. Negotiating early is good. Locking down the scope is important. So we wouldn't advocate, if you were bringing on a vendor, trying to do the work and negotiate the contract at the same time. That creates for a lot of challenges and a lot of churn in a project. So knowing that up front, understanding the key measures and how you're going to measure performance with the vendor, right? The SLAs are one thing, but there's a whole bunch of underpinning measures that need to be considered, right? What are the integration requirements? What's the frequency of information exchange, right? And how are we interacting in terms of knowledge that we're using to manage the environment? So knowledge articles, the ability to exchange data back and forth with some regularity. You need to have those things figured out ahead of time, right? The other thing, when we talk about integration architecture, is looking at performance, right? Making sure we understand today, how the instance is performing, right? Making sure that we understand capacity requirements, especially for self-hosted environments, right? And then making sure that we've got, coordination across resources, right? So making sure that, network and databases and all of those things that need to be considered from a performance perspective are at least a part of that integration architecture and also a part of your regression testing and analysis, right? Next thing is network connectivity, right? If we're defining endpoints and how we're communicating, we want to make sure that we have our firewalls configured, right? Any security protocols, that we've got that all sorted out ahead of time. So bringing those folks in early, right? Any exceptions to your VPN or IP ranges, right? For authentication, we want to make sure that we have that all figured out. Again, when we did our project, we made sure that we did a design up front. We have worked with other clients and seen where a design was not done up front. I can tell you a little bit of time that you spend doing that design up front goes a long way for all of these things that are not really major things to figure out, but become major when they become stumbling blocks one at a time, when they're discovered along the way of, oops, I didn't think of that. Oh, we didn't plan for that. Let's get somebody involved and figure it out. So the upfront design piece is very important. Disaster recovery, the ability to be able to recover from an outage, right? Whether it's a network outage, right, or something happening with an instance or something. How do we have workarounds to be able to make sure that we can continue doing business, right? What are our backup measures, right? How are we able to diagnose the problem to be able to resume business, right? So things happen. We just want to make sure that we're able to effectively continue business with our vendor in the event that that automation or integration activity is not in place, right? Testing. This is kind of one-on-one stuff, but we find it missed a lot, right? But if we're going through designing an architecture, coming up with our prerequisites, defining our functional specs and defining our technical specs, when we get to UAT, right, we should be able to have traceability back to satisfying the requirements and also having the ability to make sure that we can effectively test what's going to happen from a day one readiness perspective, right? So that means in your testing scenarios, making sure that not only your users are there to do functional testing, right, and acceptance testing, but making sure that the vendor has users available and that you are simulating ticket exchange, you are simulating an operational scenario so that you're not figuring that out on day one. So that testing integration is an important component. Couple other things, training, go live, post go live, right? If we plan this work all along, we've made sure that we've at least mapped all of the dependencies that we're able before day one to substantiate readiness, right? And we have a plan for day one that includes coverage on both sides, right? Both the vendor side and the client side, right? And being able to anticipate volume spikes, right? So if you're bringing on a vendor, if they're providing a new service, if you're changing a technology, you're changing a set of operational characteristics that need to be accounted for. So you've got to have a plan in place to be able to deal with that, right? You have to have a plan. You have to have a backup plan. You've got to make sure that you're anticipating, volume spikes and what may come up in the environment as a result of that change, right? That's really the major considerations. There's certainly a lot of little things that have popped up along the way in the work that we're doing, but with the advanced planning that we did from a design perspective, treating it like a project, understanding the integration points, putting a focus on operational readiness, we were able to, keep the small items small. So.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dan. Great. So, some of the things Dan talked about here around onboarding and offboarding, and just to really cement some of those kind of activities, certain things that we see a lot is RFPs and bids, right? And really having that consistent bid structure allows you to compare apples to apples, right? And often we've used these in the past a lot for on-prem or perpetual type software, but with cloud it becomes quite different. You're buying a service, and a lot of the things that you would ask previously no longer become relevant in terms of how certain things are done and your span of control or influence over things. So, we will, I think one of the questions was around, will we share the slides and the recording? Of course, that'll be available after the event. But one of the things, this is something I worked on with a customer recently, around just putting a more modern approach, if you will, around the bid structure. And for them, in this case, this turned into building an application to do it. And they went out to their vendors and said, hey, you're our guys. You're going to be selected for this stuff. We want to invite you in. Let's have this through an onboarding portal. No more spreadsheets, no more massive Word documents that we print, we review, we end up scoring and trying to figure out what's going on. Let's turn this into a much more systematic programmatic approach. But also then we can use metrics and weightings and, demand charts and different things to really figure out, A versus B, and take the emotion out of it so that it's more of a measured decision, if you will, in terms of what we're asking for. We're comparing them like for like, but we're also applying very consistent assessment criteria to the responses. And off the back of that, they were then able to use that to drive better decisions, but ultimately they got a huge amount of speed leverage out of that and agility, whereby it was a lot simpler process to go to market and start to source those additional suppliers or even test the waters of what something might look like, because they had a simple, quick, and easy way to do it. And it wasn't kind of, this huge monolithic exercise that they would have to go to. Off the back of it, this is just an example of a kind of a checklist, if you will, that they put together. And, one of the most important things for them was to establish a baseline. Do we even know, honestly, where we are today, so that we can baseline it and even, being fair to the supplier that's coming in, they know what they're walking into. There's no surprises. And we know what the service levels are today, regardless of what they want to commit to or try and, achieve or improve over time. At least we know where we are, we know where we want to go, and are we actually on that journey? And having that consistent model and baseline around it becomes super simple. The other thing was all around, basic supplier information being available. If something goes bump or there's an issue or there's a problem, who do we even contact? How do we escalate? What's the right information? Often over time, we'll build up relationships with kind of people on the other side, if you will. But too often this is held in a contract somewhere or, in someone's mailbox or contact list, or God help you, their Rolodex, in your supplier or vendor management team. And it's really difficult to bring that together. So what they were trying to do is make that a lot more transparent, but also had quite clear process and rules of engagement around when to escalate, who to escalate to, the type of information required, and so on. And it's because it became a lot simpler for them because they were all using the same portal. They all had the same information at the same time, and it kind of got rid of a lot of that them and us. And they had a lot more constructive conversations rather than just, hey, our hair's on fire, we need to escalate this now, drop everything you're doing. It was a lot more controlled and measured in terms of kind of the approach that they then took. And then, just an example here of this kind of setup, if you will, or onboard if you're bringing a new service provider on board, what are they? What's the foundational information? So contact information, escalation details. What services do we even have from these guys and providers around the world? And then what are the offerings? Are they existing? Are they enhancements to what we've already got? Are they changes? Are they new services? But also, looking at that menu card, what's in scope, what's even out of scope, so we know what we're doing, what we've got. So as we get into the meat of this and we're starting to operate these services, we know exactly wide open what it's got. And then you've got the day-to-day run aspects. With SLAs, what does the catalog look like? Simple things like assignment groups and assets and CIs and the portals and the links and, sounds very simple things, but how is this going to work? As Dan said, simulating that exercise of this is what we're going to do Monday. Does it work? Do we even know? Are we kind of going into the unknown without knowing the unknowns as well? And having all this kind of core foundational information all goes into this measurement side of things of, reporting, analytics, that are all, many times you have KPIs and targets that are part of your contracts, but the setup and the operation of that service doesn't always get done right to enable you to quickly and easily to assess the service levels against those that you've been contractually signed up for. So if we talk about measurement briefly, over time you want to move to this model of getting away from metrics and counting things. You might get a little bit more mature with KPIs and starting to try and understand, true performance indicators. But really where you want to be going is that higher level value. What's going on? Are we getting the benefit? Is the service providing for what we're paying for, but also what our expectations are? And having that kind of single source of truth view of the world hopefully takes the emotion out of, the vendor only providing reports that are all green and say the service is fantastic, but the user's expectations or the user perception of that service is absolutely the inverse of that. And you get into these kind of difficult situations where we put improvement plans in place, and are we chasing the right thing? Are we actually trying to improve the right thing? Or is that symptom of a different problem? And this is often, kind of where we end up, that classic like-for-like model where we kind of really just move some of these things over to the provider and expect them to provide what we know, what we're used to seeing and what these metrics look like. Across the core operational things, you may get some upticks, maybe in SLM or capacity or even workforce management and utilization. But often, we're not looking at, we're telling the vendor what we want versus really looking at what they can provide us to improve what we're doing, and eyes wide open in terms of what those things look like. So now you can kind of go up higher in that value chain, as we said, to start looking at things like sourcing, how do they exploit technology, organization design, governance, program management, leadership, what do they look like? Many people get measured, as do we, in Forrester's Wave and the Magic Quadrants and all these other things. They're all things we should be bringing into these kind of measurement frameworks to truly understand, are we in a good place now? Will we be in a good place in 3 years' time? Is this vendor kind of dying on the vine and they're losing customers because there's another service provider coming up who's dominating, right? And they're kind of taking over at this space, or their longer-term roadmap and vision really aligns better with me as an organization rather than where my current provider is, to give me insight into that and understand it, and therefore I can make better decisions further down the line accordingly. So then in terms of kind of what this might look like, Dan and the team put together a maturity framework, if you will, to look at this and understand it and assess what these capabilities might look like. And you get the classic kind of diagram and the maturity model pop out where you look at, are we unreliable all the way through optimized, and starting to understand, as I said, where you really need to focus, what you need to focus on, and focus on those problems rather than the ones that people are necessarily super emotional or attached to, or maybe they built their careers on. We kind of have to be big boys and girls about this and understand our role in the organization and say, these are the things we need to go focus on. And it maybe there's a point player or a specific SME that can provide this capability for us, to really improve that service. And it may be a short-term engagement to drive up maturity, and then we might be able to bring it back in-house and run it ourselves, just because at this point we don't have the right capability and resource to do it. So, we've talked a lot about outcomes along the way. I know we're kind of losing a bit of our time here, so we'll leave time at the end for some questions here. But really what we wanted to talk about here was looking at the model, right? What are the real outcomes and having that desired state? Now, sometimes you'll get to all of these, but sometimes you won't. There may be things that, just priorities change along the way. But having that clear mode of kind of the alignment, how we onboard, how we offboard, how we measure, and then are we getting not just the efficiency and gains and outsourcing, selling that big world of doing it cheaper, using offshore resources doesn't always get you the benefit that you want. Yes, you may save a few bucks, but ultimately it's about the service levels and the service delivery, and kind of where we go from there. So just finally, and I'll invite Dan to comment here, bringing this all together is about, ServiceNow as the platform, the customer, really the people that have to own and manage and run these services, and then also the service providers that are out there as well. Dan, anything just in closing you want to add to that?
Chris, I think you summed it up well. I think, tight integration here is the objective, and we were able to balance the customer needs, the service providers' concerns and needs, along with the use of the platform to come up with something that worked well for everybody.
Fantastic. All right, so I know we're pretty tight on the clock here. There's still quite a few people that are online, so if you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A window. You can also contact us afterwards, obviously, but we'll just pause here for a minute. I think we've got a couple of minutes to go, and if there are any questions that pop up. We have got actually a couple here, so something around, how do we prioritize this? What might be a logical approach? So hopefully, we've kind of addressed some of those questions here. People look at something that's burning, right, or a service that might be struggling or not performing well. And that could be team, it could be the technology, it could be the thing that's actually running it as well. A logical approach is often looking at what the problem is and what do we want it to be. And often customers get into this mode of, well, even if we gave you that tomorrow, would you be mature enough to adopt it or run it? And just because you can have all those things, we often talk about the maturity of level 1 through 5. A 3 may be good enough in certain situations. And I think, that's good enough in some cases. Being a 5, okay, great, but it comes with cost. It comes with resource, and it comes with a lot of kind of other things that are a result of it that your organization might not even be ready to adopt anyway, in terms of kind of where that's going and what it needs to look for. Dan, anything from you?
Chris, I just think one question around major risks associated with the initiative. From an organizational perspective, I think the ability to evaluate operational readiness is where the biggest risk is, right? So the integrated testing, having a plan for day one, I think those where your major risks are. So I think that being able to evaluate that from both sides, both the vendor and the organization, are critical. Fantastic.
Cool. All right. Well, I think we are pretty much out of time there. So I want to thank everybody that attended today. Dan, thanks as always for riding shotgun with me on this one. We'll send in a follow-up email after the event with the recording, I think, and some additional information. But again, thanks everyone for your time, and I'm sure we'll speak to you again in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Chris.